And we should be live. Yeah.
Good. Well, welcome to the virtual meeting of the Audit Committee of Northamptonshire County Council. This is a virtual meeting and it's also being broadcast simultaneously on the Council's YouTube channel, Northamptonshire Democracy. My name is Bill Jessup and I am the independent chairman of the Audit Committee. Just before we start, some important online housekeeping for everyone present. First of all, please ensure that any mobile phones around you are on silent. Please keep your microphone muted when not speaking, and then obviously unmute to speak. Only one person should speak at a time, and I as chairman will call those to speak, and keep an eye on the gallery view to see who would like to ask questions. For members, if you'd also like to hit the question button too, that might just help me to see who wants to ask a question and get you in the right order. So before we start the meeting, we need to have an attendance roll call. And so Barbara, could you do that for us, please?
I can. When I say your name, can you confirm that you are present at the meeting, please? This is in alphabetical order. Councillor Cecile Irving-Swift.
Present.
Councillor Stephen Legg.
Present.
Councillor John McGee.
Present.
Councillor Steve Osborne.
Present.
And Councillor Bill Parker.
Present.
I can confirm that we have all of the committee members present, Chair.
Thank you. We do indeed have all the members present, so there are no apologies. I'm aware that Councillor Jim Hakewill wants to speak on item 6, but there are no other members of the public or others that want to speak. Is that correct?
That is correct. Nobody else has registered apart from Councillor Hakewill.
Thank you. So item 3, declaration of members' interests.
Yes, please, Mr. Chairman. Item 7, I'm a member and deputy chair of the Northamptonshire Local Government Pension Fund, and I will withdraw from the meeting from that particular item. Barbell said she'd put me in a cupboard.
Could I say the same thing, Chairman, that I'm also a member of the Pension Committee and been advised to withdraw from that item?
Yeah, that's perfect, as long as you're not both in the same cupboard.
I think we'd have a bit of a job to get in there. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Chairman's announcements. The only announcement is that I might delay item 8, which is the external audit item, until Barry can join us. I think it's appropriate that he should be here for that item. So dealing with the minutes, I think we can do this by affirmation. First of all, any questions or comments on the minutes? No. So is anybody not content that we approve the minutes? Perfect. So I think we can say the minutes are approved. And so that moves us on to the agenda, item 6. Now, I'll just make a couple of comments before I ask Jim to speak. First of all, I'd like to welcome Paul back to the meeting, who's going to take us through his presentation. Thank you for that. I should say that the Audit Committee actually has got a fairly limited concern in relation to future Northants, because obviously we'll not be around. But it seemed to me that there were 3 things that we probably should understand. First of all, we need to understand what safe and legal plus means, so we understand the implications for the workings of the council until the end of March. Secondly, we need to understand the timing of the go and the no-go decisions, because that's relevant to how long the committee continues in operation. Obviously, at the minute, we will cease at March next year, but if there's a no-go decision on the unitary, obviously that gives us another 12 months of life. And the third thing is we just need to understand from a governor's point of view who makes the go and no-go decisions and what role Northampton County Councils and its officers are going to take in that decision. So they were the things that were in the back of my mind in putting this item on the agenda. So before we move to Paul for his presentation, I'm sure he's going to answer all those 3 questions somewhere in that. Jim, would you like to speak? And Barbara, you can set the timepiece going, please.
I will.
Thank you, Chairman. I should and declare I'm a deferred member of the pension scheme. I was in it for as long as the government allowed councillors to be in it. So I'm a deferred member of the local government pension scheme. If I draw your attention to Paul's presentation, page 3, disaggregation in the revised programme, on the right-hand side of the page of page 3, I guess everyone's read it, but for some bigger county council, being disaggregated is likely we'll need to recruit additional service resources, manage teams, functions, may lose the economy of scale, resources and so on. So I guess everyone's probably found that particular page. The point I wanted to make, and perhaps it's because I'm the only one who's registered to speak, is that it is quite hard to find opportunities to express a concern that even before, and from an audit point of view, this will be audit whoever is your successor after March in a year or 18 months time, is that the timescale was too tight before COVID, and the issues around social services, which are 3/4 of our budget, are, in my opinion, necessarily needing to be directed towards actually looking after those vulnerable people in the county. There are examples elsewhere of super districts, and in my opinion, it would be much better to have a north and west super district where aggregation is far simpler, not affecting in the large term social services. So I just wanted to pick that up, and I appreciate your pre-comment that it may or may not be the right point to do it, but I wanted to pick that up. Subsequently, the pension papers came along for this committee, and I'd just like your forbearance to make the point that the pension strain, as we move towards the end of March, many people may well either decide to leave or be made redundant. And I do remember at Kettering, when we had a reorganisation back in 2002, there was about £500,000 of strain on the budget, which was capitalised to meet pensionable costs for KBC at that time. We don't know who's likely to leave, whether long-term, short-term, or whether there is redundancy. And the question I really wanted to ask or pose to the committee now or for the future was, what sort of calculations are there, given we don't know who will move into the 2 new authorities, for the strain of pensions, either for NCC or for the 2 new authorities? And I very much appreciate you, Chairman and committee, for allowing me to come along and make those 2 points. And I'm glad the bell didn't go off. Thank you, Barbell, for putting it at 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I think on the pensions thing is an interesting point. The auditors are on the line, so I'm sure they'll pick that up. It's probably something that will be dealt with by our successor, because any entry in the accounts would relate to the current financial year. And of course, that will be after this committee's departed, but the point's obviously noted. So, Paul, over to you for the presentation. Now, I think you're going to take over the screen and go through the presentation, which, given Royal Mail's inability to deliver hard copy of the papers, is probably a good thing. But I think that means that we probably need to just keep questions until the end, because I won't see who's waving the hand, because Paul's presentation will be on screen. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I understand Barbell's actually going to share the presentation, not me. I haven't got the presentation to share. So that should be coming up now. There we go. So can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So if you could just move to the next slide, please, Barbell. And just wanted to, which just sets a little bit of background. Thank you. So just wanted to, I will respond to Councillor Haquell's points as I go through the presentation, because they are in here, and there are things that I did want to cover anyway. So I will respond as I go through. So pre-COVID, we'd made really good progress. We'd managed to collect all the data. We were working in workshops with service areas, on a weekly basis in where I'm sat now in the engine room, and we were having many conversations around what we needed to do and the things that we needed to put in place. And that was right up until the pandemic. Obviously, we had to reprioritize all our resources, and people have responded magnificently to that, and they've done in days and weeks what would normally take months and years to do, and we've learned a lot from that. And I will touch on that as I go through. But obviously the impact of COVID has an impact on people. It's got an impact on the time available now, obviously, and it has an impact on the finances of not just this council, not just the 7 districts and borough councils, but every local authority in the country is assessing the impact of COVID and the potential for another spike at some point in the future. So in terms of how we've responded to all that, whilst many of my colleagues were working on the front line to support our residents, behind the scenes what we were working on was a methodology and a plan to how we might comply with the amendments that were made to the structural changes order. So as you know, the elections in May were postponed, and an amendment to the structural changes order was made that set out the governance of the shadow authorities, and still a requirement on Northamptonshire to maintain vesting day as the 1st of April 2021. So there were other things set out in the changes order, but the main things there was how they dealt with the political leadership and the fact that there has been no change to vesting day. So those shadow authorities are now up and running. They've met as shadow authorities for the North and the West, and they've met twice as the shadow executives. And all those meetings take place in the public arena in a similar way to we're doing now via Zoom and being broadcast via YouTube. And I think the exam question that I was given was what really does safe and legal plus mean? So Barbel, if you could just move on to the next slide, please. This is not something that I've written for this presentation. This is an extract from the Prospectus for Change, the next chapter. So whilst we were working through COVID, we actually set out how we'd respond to the challenges that have been presented to us. And you will know that there was a Prospectus for Change written some time ago now, and that's available publicly on the Future Northants website. And what we wrote was the next chapter, which this is an extract from. And this is also the full document. I've just put a couple of slides in from it here, but the full document is also available publicly on the Future Northants website. So the points I would just make here in terms of safe and legal, I've lost the screen. Is that you, Barbel?
I do apologise, but bear with me a second, a bit of technical difficulties. I will get it back.
Shall I keep talking, Chair, while Barbel?
Yeah, by all means.
Oh, okay. So a unitary authority, by definition, has about 900 or so statutory responsibilities, not services, but statutory responsibilities. And what safe and legal means is that we can conduct and carry out those statutory responsibilities from vesting day. So, and that has a massive range of things, from emptying the dustbins to being able to collect council tax, and in terms of health and social care, we have to be able to carry out those really important statutory functions as well. And all the work that we've done is to ensure that we understand what they are and how we're going to deliver them. And I just want the committee to understand that all that work was collected as part of the approach leading up to the COVID outbreak. So we're not just doing that now. That work was all done and all understood, but the focus of the programme prior to COVID was a transformational programme. And what we've had to do is look at how much of that transformational activity we can still do, bearing in mind that we have to ensure those safe and legal aspects of all those kind of 900 or so statutory functions. And the plus part is anything that we can do, we will do prior to vesting day around transformation. But the program's been redesigned now, so we've got a 2-year program that will follow vesting day, which will pick up all those transformational opportunities and all those fuller integration opportunities that we're not able to do prior to vesting day. And the plus bit is very much whatever we can do on top of safe and legal. And I'll try and respond to Councillor Haquill's question here really around timescales being too tight, and the importance of disaggregation in respect of social care services, which is a really good point. And again, I'll go back to the fact that much of that work was done before COVID. And for adults are in a really good position. So we've not stopped any of the great work that they've been doing. In fact, we've enhanced it through the learning that's come out of COVID, as I referred to earlier. There are many good things that we've been able to do that we mustn't stop doing and must continue to do in the future, because it served our residents really well. It's ensured that we can work with colleagues in health and across the system in ways that we would have hoped to get to, but would have taken longer than having to deal with them really quickly. So adults will do a soft disaggregation of all their services. And remember, these are community-based services that are delivered in communities. So disaggregation kind of takes care of itself in that sense, because they are focused on residents, and the new model in adults is very much focused on individuals, those communities that they live in, and making sure those services are accessible to those communities and tied in wherever possible to frontline health services as well, so it makes sense to residents. So we're on track to do a soft disaggregation in October and test all that out prior to the firm disaggregation on the 1st of April. The other thing I would say on Councillor Haquill's question is that the Children's Trust is part of Future Northampton, the creation of the Children's Trust. And we're aiming for the Children's Trust to go live before vesting day. And that's one Children's Trust that provides critical services that support families and children across the county. So we're not splitting the duties of the trust and the responsibilities of the trust, but clearly the two unitaries have the statutory responsibility on a north and west basis for the outcomes of children's services, and are accountable for those outcomes. But the holistic approach to meeting the needs of Northamptonshire is focused in one organisation that's serving the whole of the county. So that would be my response to Councillor Haquill's points around social care. And if I'm, please, Barbel, thank you. So I won't go through all the points on here, but that sets out the focus that we're aiming to put in place. There's clearly much of the work was done before. There are now task and finished groups that are represented, given the context and the recovery phase. And, you know, as I said at the beginning, this is not a Northamptonshire problem. It's a problem for every local authority in the country. We've got the added complication, admittedly, of creating two new unitaries as well as recovery. But it is something that we all have to be mindful of, and understanding the ability to set budgets that are deliverable through the normal timelines and the normal consultation with residents at the relevant time in that process. We've realigned the whole of the programme. We've reduced it from 13 programmes down to 6 or 7, dependent on whether you call one of them a portfolio. We've streamlined the governance of each of those programmes. The previous programme had all 8 chief execs leading on them. What we've done is try to build in some resilience. So if there is another outbreak of COVID, that those chief execs are now critical friends on those programs, not leading the programs. So if they have to revert back to their authorities to deal with another outbreak, it won't necessarily have a major impact on the ability to deliver the program. So that was the point on those slides. And then just moving on to the next slide, please, Barbel. As I said, much of the work was complete, gathered, and a really good understanding was in place before the lockdown. We are cautious, of course, about the potential for ongoing impact. We know that things are starting to ease and that measures are in place to further ease things in July. In line with our predictions in March, and they were very much finger in the air, admittedly, because we just didn't know. We made some assumptions, and those assumptions are set out on this page, and they're in the public domain on the website in this document, as I referred to. And one of those assumptions was that things would start to turn to normal in July, and that we could pick up the pace in time for implementation and the new implementation phase once we've got the blueprints agreed for a safe and legal local authority in the north and the west. We've set out some of the risks there in terms of, at high level, in terms of the potential for another outbreak, and some of the things that we don't fully know around issues. So how much of the workforce capacity is going to be available to support the implementation and all those kinds of things. So just moving on to the next slide. Sorry, Barbel, could you go back one, please? I think there should be another, oh, right, okay. It might be in a different order then, there should be, is there another slide? That one, yeah, sorry, they're just in a different order in my presentation. So where we are right now is that in terms of safe and legal, we are working through what that means for the county council. And we're really pleased to say that because of all the work that was done before and the intensive work that's been done by many colleagues behind the scenes, we think we're in a position to fully disaggregate a large number of county council services, so split on day one, to where they will permanently reside in the north and the west. There are a small number of services that we're working through which we don't think it will be safe or legally possible to do by vesting day. And we'll be putting those into a host authority, whether that's north or whether it's west, some will go into a host authority. And that'll be a short-term arrangement to allow us the time to do the work that's necessary to ensure that they're safe and legal. And some might be 3 months, some might be 6 months, up to a maximum of 12 months. And then there are other services that we think is more appropriate to put into a lead authority. That would be a long-term arrangement. And some of those things may be the things that are more transactional and that work away behind the scenes, like payroll, for example, where to split it would probably increase the costs of doing it with no perceived value to the residents. So we want to ensure that most of the available budget is focused on what's most important to the residents and that we minimise the cost of back office services. And one of the ways to do that is not to split them. So we're working through that. None of this has gone through governance. The governance would be in the public domain. But we've moved through what we think is the approach for the county council services. And we have a good understanding of what that is. And the other part of the blueprint is we've then got to overlay that, all those services that are delivered by districts and borough councils, and to be safe and legal on day one. So that's aggregation, where we're bringing in the west and the north, for example, 3 or 4 of those functions into one function. And we're working through that at the moment. We're just validating the FTE figures so that we can complete the picture around what a service blueprint would look like. And why we're being careful around the FTE figures in districts and borough services is where a service might be quite small, there may be a person, one FTE, that's covering a number of different functions. So they do part of the job in several areas. So we need to make sure we fully understand that as part of the blueprint. So when we lay those on top of the county council, we'll have a service blueprint. And then the final piece of that jigsaw is the finance side and the disaggregation of the county council's budget and the aggregation of the districts and borough budgets. And that's the last piece in the jigsaw, really. And that's being informed by the, well, there's 3 member task and finish groups that cover the remit of finances. One of those is disaggregation. The other is around council tax. And then the other is around the medium-term financial plan. So the work of those 3 will feed into the final piece of the jigsaw. And as we all know, and I'm sure you're aware of, no council will fully understand its budget position at this point in the year. There's more information that feeds in over the coming months. Final settlement figures don't always come through till government until sometime around Christmas or even after Christmas. So it is an iterative process setting the budget. So that needs to be managed carefully by all the 151 officers working together. And we have a finance programme as part of Future Northants, and the chair of that programme and the lead on it is Barry Scarr. And that is, you know, one of the risks that we're managing in terms of what's happened with COVID and being able to set deliverable budgets. So the plan will be to go into implementation phase, subject to approval to these blueprints in August. And the plans that are coming together, if you could just move on to the, I think it's the slide before on yours now, Barbell, and the slide after on my pack. Thank you. So what we're pulling together is a day one safe and legal assurance piece. So of those 6 or 7 programs that I mentioned, they've all got detailed plans, they've all got detailed deliverables for safe and legal, and some of those are set out on there. So for safe and legal, we need to do things for certain services, and there are about 50 of those minimum requirements, and we're calling them colloquially must-haves. They're not applicable to every service area. Some of them are applicable to every service area and some to specific ones. So for our enforcement services, we've got to make sure that they're legally compliant around the ability to enforce, whether that's parking enforcement or any other kind of enforcement. They have to have the right warrants in place. So that's just one example of what safe and legal would mean. That people have to have the right accreditation to get in the right buildings. Something that everybody will need is making sure that we can pay them on day one so that they're on the right payroll, and then we have to understand which service they work in, and we have to understand what the line management arrangements are to do all those things. And we have to have an agreed budget in place for those services. And whilst all those activities sit in different programs, they have to come together in a critical path. And in tangent with creating the blueprint, we've had a focus on managing and creating that critical path, and that work's nearly complete now. So understanding the sequence of how we have to do those things, then making sure that there is a project to deliver every one of those things in every one of the programs is an important factor, and making sure that critical path is then clearly mapped out, and that's what the program will be reporting on to the two shadow authorities and the shadow executives. And Chair, I think one of the questions that you asked was about go decisions and also who makes those decisions. So I'll start, if I may, with who makes those decisions. So the primary responsibility for those shadow authorities is they don't run services. Those services are still being run by the county council and the districts and borough services, so they don't have the responsibility of running services as a shadow authority. They do have the responsibility of ensuring that the new authorities can go live on day one. So that's their main function. and it will be the shadow executives within those shadow authorities that make the ultimate decision as to the ability to go live on the 1st of April or not. And we've built in two reviews. We're doing a review in July, which is based around the risks that were set out in the earlier one. So are we sufficiently coming out of the restrictions placed on us by COVID so that we can start the implementation phase? So that's the first milestone. And we're having some independent help with that through the LGA, and the programme had a critical friend allocated way back in the old programme, Andrew Flockhart, and he's going to provide some external challenge and robustness around what is an internal review. And then later in the year, we've agreed with government that we will do a full review of the ability to go live on day one. And it'd be there wouldn't be enough work done to do it any sooner than around about November time to be able to measure progress. And November time would then give us a very clear understanding of whether there was anything that was mission critical that couldn't be put in place that would stop us going live on day one. So hopefully that's set the scene, explained a little bit about what safe and legal is, those 900 statutory functions and those 50 or so must-haves for day one, and how we're managing the programme and who's responsible for making those go, no-go decisions, and the steps that we're taking in the programme to provide as much assurance as we possibly can to everyone that needs to be assured the ability to go live on the 1st of April. Thank you, Chair, and I'm more than happy through yourself to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Paul. That's very good, and it's always good to get the questions in first because then you know you're going to get the answers. Presumably the November date is also partly dictated by the fact that in the unlikely event that there was a no-go decision, the legacy councils all need sufficient time to agree a budget and set a rate. So I can understand why November is the critical time for that particular decision. So members, any questions? Stephen, I saw your hand wave. You want to go? You need to unmute though.
Thank you, Chairman. Is that better?
Yes, it's much better.
Thank you. I understood that at the beginning of this process, the option of safe and legal wasn't really attractive because we were going to offer the residents of the county the opportunity to transform all our services and to have two single unitaries that would be better than what we had before. It seems to me that we're just sort of bodging together something that's safe and legal and doesn't really seem to take us very much further. And is it also the case that on vesting day, the existing chief executives all cease to operate in their own districts and boroughs? Because I know they don't exist, but there's going to seem to me to be no continuity between those officers. And also, of course, we're going to be starting with a completely new council as well. It seems to me difficult to convince myself that that's safe and legal. Thank you.
Paul, I'm sure you'd like to respond to that. I'm sure you probably wouldn't agree with the representation of it being bodged up, but I think the point about continuity of management is a valid point. So would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Councillor Legge, thank you. I'm not offended by the word bodged. I understand where you're coming from, and I would like to assure everybody that we are certainly not bodging anything, and ensuring that we are safe and legal on day one is the primary responsibility. And you are right. The original intention was for a transformational programme, and if you do go online and have a look at the original prospectus, and then you read the next chapter, I think you'll see in there that whilst we've had to reorganise the programme and focus on safe and legal for situations that have been completely out of everybody's control, I think you'll see that we have not lost any of that ambition or aspiration for our residents to transform services and to try and create the best two performing local authorities in the country. Adult social care makes up for about 60% or so of the overall expenditure of the local authorities. And they are well on the journey to transforming what they do and how they support residents. And as I said, that will start to happen in October. So that is a massive part of transformation that the residents that rely on those services provided by Anna and her team will be able to access in very different ways, and very focused on residents and communities and how we support them and how we help them to help themselves and each other in a very different way. So we will be delivering transformation on day one. And right at the beginning of the presentation, I did say that what we have been able to do is, at no extra cost I would add as well, is realign the programme so that we will have 2 years of transformation after vesting day. I hear many stories of local authorities that went through this process and they're still implementing changes 10 years afterwards. And I certainly don't want Northamptonshire to be in that situation. So we will be defining what those transformational aspirations will be. We've got them all. We put them to one side when COVID struck, and we will be resurrecting all those as we move into and leading up to go live with the resources and the expertise to support services in a program wrap with all those kind of safety nets and rigor and so on to deliver those transformational aspects that are very much deserved by all the residents of Northamptonshire. On the continuity and chief execs, yes, we won't have 8 chief execs on day one. We have got 2 interim chief execs now that are working in shadow authority form, and their primary responsibility, along with the shadow interim monitoring officers and 151 officers, is to ensure that these councils are set up safe and legally. We are also recruiting permanent roles. Those are out to advert and we're getting fantastic responses. There's lots of very senior, very good people want to come and work in Northamptonshire, which is very encouraging. We created a microsite, which is getting lots of attention. And those roles that we're advertising and recruiting to are 2 new chief executives, 2 151 officers, 2 monitoring officers, a DCS, and it'll be 1 DCS that oversees the Children's Trust and works across both authorities, again tying together a whole county view of children's services, and 2 DASs, 2 Director of Adult Social Services. We are aiming, subject to notice periods, that the chief execs will be in post first in October, possibly November, and those other posts very soon after. And obviously we've got lots of good people in tier 2 and tier 3 levels, and we're working through the HR process that will ensure that we understand what those tier 2 and tier 3 and bring that continuity that's needed at that level will be fully understood for vesting day and will be in place. And that's where that kind of service continuity, that continuity with our residents will sit. But also we'll have new people in post before we go live to ensure that they can pick up the transformational challenges and start to create that culture of resident first that we all want in these 2 new organisations.
Thank you, John. You've got a question.
Thank you, Chair. I have several questions. First one is, given the situation that we're in, how much has this cost us up to date, and how much are we presuming it will cost us? And that will be a hard figure given the COVID situation. And will we be able to meet that budget, and where will that budget come from? Secondly, you mentioned the 900 statutory responsibilities that we have, about 900. Is that on the website? If not, can members have a copy of that? That is something over several years as a county councillor we've never been able to see written on black and white. So it'd be nice to get that list so that we can ensure moving forward that that is happening. The other thing is the Children's Trust. Of course, that's a worry for us all. It may not happen on vesting day. How do we envisage where that will sit? Who will monitor it? Who will control the budget, etc.? And how do we ensure that service has been provided correctly? Thank you, Chair.
Paul?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for those questions. So, in terms of the cost, the budget is in the public domain. It was presented at the West Shadow Executive on Tuesday night, and it will be presented tonight at the North Shadow Executive. And there'll be an update on the finances there. And as I say, that is in the public domain. It is fully funded. We have rescoped the programme, as I say, to deliver 2 years of transformation post-vesting day at no extra cost. What we have brought in since the original prospectus was the County Council's transformation programme in 2021, which we couldn't bring in until that was approved by the County Council in March. We've now included that and the benefits from that. So there is a change in the figures, but we reported that change, although not the exact nature of it, from last Christmas at the at the joint committees for the North and the West. So the programme is still being delivered for the original 43 million, and what we brought into it is the County Council's transformation programme, the cost for that, and the benefits, the financial benefits that will accrue from that as well. And we're closely monitoring the benefits realisation. It is clearly an important part of this, and that's why the impact of COVID and not being fully understood has the potential to have an impact. But we also believe that that impact, if it is an impact, will probably be more around pushing those benefits out a little bit rather than not delivering those benefits at all. So not kicking them into the long grass, just reprofiling them for where any of that work has actually had to be paused for COVID. And of course, there's a lot of learning from COVID, as I mentioned earlier. And some of those things may well add benefit, certainly to residents, but also there might be financial benefits of working in different ways. You know, we've not all driven to a meeting today and spent money on petrol and mileage and all that kind of thing. So some really good stuff that doesn't need to stop after that. In terms of the 900 or so statutory responsibilities, they'll all be set out in our must-have plan for day one. You're shaking your head, Councillor. I'm saying there will be. They're not at the moment, but we're working through that and making sure they're all mapped out. We can put that in the public domain. That's absolutely fine. Once we've locked that down and we've got the approvals in place, that'll all be set out. And in terms of the Children's Trust question, the Children's Trust, the responsibility for the Children's Trust still sits with each of the new authorities. They carry the statutory responsibilities. So as part of the creation of the Children's Trust, we're also creating a client function. And that client, there will be a client function in the North Unitary and a client function in the West Unitary. They will hold the budget for children's services. And the mechanisms will all be set out in contracts as to how that will be managed and monitored. And the reason that we want one DCS is partly to pick up on what Councillor Hakewell's points at the beginning around having single oversight on a system across Northamptonshire with one DCS who represents both those authorities, who will attend both scrutiny committees on children's services that will report to a chair of children's services in both organisations, and translate the requirements of both organisations into a single coherent message to the trust around what their deliverables and responsibilities are in that new organisation going forward.
And thank you, Paul. I'd certainly be interested to see that list of statutory responsibilities, and presumably that's going to be available fairly shortly, because you would need that in order to do the risk assessment in July, August time. Cecile, you've got a question?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So thank you. Yes, we have listened for nearly 1 hour. And if people are on the web, they might not understand. The main points that Paul said very clearly, 60% of all our budget goes on adult social care. And that is a crucial. And the question I have to ask, regardless of what we decide, what happened on the 1st of April, and that was your question, if for the audit committee, you call that paper if we had to postpone a bit more for us to see what we have to audit, because our purpose as a committee is not to scrutinize the future, it's to make sure that the audit is done correctly and we have enough knowledge of how long we have to have audit committee that matters. Now, as far as I'm concerned, where we will see if the program is in a good place or not might be with when we have the audit of last year and see how we have changed the services, because if 60% of all our services at the county goes towards adult social care, the audit committee will have its view of how the money was spent, and that will for us audit answer a lot of questions. As far as the program is concerned, my things, we have produced ream and ream and ream, and we said, oh, it's all on the web and we do new things. If you ask people in the broad, and I represent a rural area, they really are not engaged, do not care what they want some things that work, and when they need the services, they need to access it. That's the end of the story. So please, for us at Audit, what is the main point? Because we are not there to scrutinize Safe and Legal Plus, despite the fact it's important, but that is not the audit. What is important is how many audits we will have before we end up the things that we have done because as we know, audit can put a spanner in the work. What do you think, Chairman?
That was a point I raised at the beginning. I mean, we're not here to scrutinise or second guess. We do need to understand, and I think Paul's presentation got us over the line on that, and we do need to understand the timing of it. We're just running over. John, well, let me go to Bill, and then we'll see whether we take one more question.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Yes, one of the major problems that the County Council has had for many, many years is that we are the fastest growing, or we're the fastest growing county in the country. And we also had the major problem that we had the fastest growing over 70s in the country. This puts tremendous pressure on adult social care. One of the things we introduced, or maybe 6-7 years ago now, was community care packages to try and keep people at home as long as they could. And the average age that people were going into care homes was 89. How are the two new unitary authorities, and you mentioned that they would be moving things because it was in homes around the various areas. How are the two unitaries going to cope with this? Because it is still a major problem for the county.
Bill, I think that's probably not one for us. I think that's a question that you probably should raise because you are actually a member of one of the unitaries. I think you should raise that. And let Paul, if you want to make a comment, that's fine. But
yeah, no, absolutely. All as I was going to say, and it's a bit of a plug really, we're just planning and organising over the next couple of weeks all member briefings in each local authority via Zoom. So that's a perfectly great question to bring along to one of those all member briefings. So it's going to cover what we're doing on adult social care. It's going to cover what more detail around the creation of the Children's Trust, and it's going to be an update on where we're at with the programme itself. And there'll be people from the trust there, so The new chair of the trust is going to be there. Anna will be there from Adult Social Care, and you'll see some of the fantastic work that's being done and how we're going to respond, as Councillor Parker's alluded to those challenges that we've got in Northamptonshire. So I would make a plug that as many of you as possible tune into one of those meetings and listen and ask questions then. Thank you, Chair.
So John, just one final question.
Just a quick follow-up. I'm surprised that Paul never mentioned any budgets. There is only a small amount of the councillors on these executives and these meetings, and there's a vast amount of councillors across this county that don't have any real idea what's happening. And a member briefing hopefully will help that. But remember, a lot of our members now won't be involved in a unitaries, and people like myself won't be involved in that. So how do you ensure the new councillors, because there will be an election and lots of new councillors, are kept up to date moving forward? And can I ask quickly, Chair, one more plug? I'm a chair of the Corby Health and Wellbeing Board. Most of the wellbeing boards are unsure how we're moving forward altogether. That would be helpful if you could get some update on that.
So Paul, would you just finally like to respond to that final point there?
Yes, certainly. I'll feed back to Anna about the health and wellbeing boards, because I know Anna's in direct conversation with all the partners about what's been happening in adult social care, and obviously in the arena of the Children's Trust. So I will feed that back about them being unsure. And in terms of all the councillors, we're also part of the programme is to make sure that we've got proper training in place for councillors as well, for councillors that may not have any experience of county council services, and for county councillors that don't have any experience of districts and borough services, to try and prepare them for the new unitaries. I fully recognise there's an election process and we don't know who the members will be then, but all the members currently are part of the shadow authorities, and that was set out in the statutory changes order, and obviously can ask questions and partake in those roles around finances and those kinds of things. And obviously that all those things end up in the public domain through the shadow executive and the discussions that they have in public as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. That was a very good presentation. I've let that run over a little bit, so we'll have to try and catch up the time as we move through the rest of the agenda. Now, we need to note Paul's report. So do any members object to noting Paul's report? No, good. So Paul's report's noted. So the next item we've got is the pensions. We've got three documents here. We've got the report, we've got the actual accounts, which we need to approve in a minute. And obviously you've got the E&Y report that Debbie's going to speak to in a minute. Barry, as you're the author of the report, is there anything that you want to add to the report, or otherwise we can, I think, broadly take that as read? Barry?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I thought Councillor Hakewell was trying to come in there. As I said, Chair, the report sets out the key highlights from the pension fund annual report and accounts, and also the feedback from the external auditors on the ISA 260. I think I would only like to highlight that at 5.1, the auditor's opinions that the accounts give a true and fair view and have been properly prepared in accordance with all accounting standards. With that, Chair, I'll hand back to the committee for the external audit to give their view, and happy to answer any questions. Okay,
we've got a question from Cecile.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I read the 83 pages. Two things in the open, and I'm sure Barry would be answered. We have how much we have the fund at 2.5 billion roughly, and we have the number of members and so on, but we do not have, maybe I read it badly, but I cannot see if the fund is on surplus, it's not on surplus, where is the position? And also the actuary made an assumption that I think it's a bit odd. It made the members dying for a man at 89 or 90 and for a woman at 92. Is that the right assumption? Because that has an impact on if we are on surplus or on deficit. Can I have clarification? How is the fund at the moment? The return, well, it's what it is. I am not really happy very much with the return, but for me, do we have a surplus, a deficit? What's the view of Barry, please?
Barry, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I can speak about that, Chair. I don't want to tiptoe underneath the work of the Pensions Committee, but the fund is fairly healthily funded at the moment, mainly because of what's been going on in terms of quantitative easing and asset prices within the markets. I'm sort of hedging my bets because one thing, and we're talking about 1819, so the fund was reasonably well funded then. As we move forward, clearly there will be an impact on property valuations as a result of COVID-19 in the retail, hospitality and leisure sector. We're not heavily invested in property at the moment, but there may be some downward valuations on our property assets within the fund because of COVID-19, but we're fairly healthily funded at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Debbie, do you want to take us through your report?
Thank you, Bill. Yes, I will do. I'll keep it fairly brief. I mean, I guess just by way of introduction, this is a report that we present before we can issue our opinion on the accounts, and it summarises the key findings from our audit work. I think overall the pension fund audit went very well from our perspective. There were not really any significant issues arising from that. We have issued you with an addendum which basically just highlights the additional work that we undertook since this audit results report was drafted back in March to address the impact of COVID-19. So if I can just take you through the executive summary. So we'd noted some areas that were still to be completed at the date of drafting the report. Those are very much the areas that we completed as part of the final closure. So we will review the final annual report and financial statements and check that once they've been approved, that they are consistent with the audit work that we've done on the draft. We've also now received the responses from management and those charged with governance in relation to our planning letters. And we're in the process of going through our final quality reviews. Some of those things we're having to update to the date of our audit report. So things like subsequent event procedures have to be done to the date of the opinion. We'll receive the letter of representation once the audit's been concluded, and we include a draft of that for the committee's information. So you're aware of what we ask management to sign in terms of those representations, and obviously the signed financial statements. As Barry's already said, we're proposing an unqualified opinion on the financial statements. I think the accounts were well prepared, very few errors, and so I think we'd like to express our thank you to the finance team as well for their support in the audit. We have highlighted two audit differences in our audit report. I would stress that these are not really due to any sort of weaknesses in controls. They are kind of national issues that arrived, or timing issues. There was one of 3.5 million which related to a level 3 or complex investment, and that was due to the date of the valuation applied by the custodian and fund manager being on two different dates. The fund manager used slightly later information, and so we took that to be more accurate, and the accounts were amended to reflect that more updated information. The 7 million adjustment is in relation to a national legal case on guaranteed minimum pension. The actuary had produced an IS 926 report which feeds your liability disclosure in note 20. Prior to that legal ruling being clarified, they therefore provided an updated report which increased the liability by 7 million that's disclosed in that note 20. We noted one minor control observation in relation to the fact that not all members had signed declarations, and instead the Council and Pension Fund had placed reliance on the declarations of interest that are made at committee meetings. We recommended that there should actually be signed and dated annual declarations, and those arrangements have been put in place, I understand, going forwards. Those were really the only points I wanted to draw to attention in the actual results report itself. I did then want to just draw your attention to the addendum that we circulated. And that really just highlights the additional procedures that we've had to undertake in relation to COVID-19. So COVID-19, because these are 1819 accounts, is clearly a post-balance sheet event for the pension fund, and there's been no adjustments to the financial statements in relation to the figures as a result of that. We have, however, identified some areas where we think additional disclosure is required in the fund accounts, and those are in relation to going concern assessment. So although we note that there is a presumption that the pension fund will continue as a going concern, the current uncertain economic environment as a result of COVID-19 does increase some of those risks. And I think those are the points that Barry's just referred to in relation to future changes in investment valuations, etc. And therefore, we've asked that the fund includes additional enhanced disclosures around that, and those have been drafted and are in the accounts. I understand that are with you for approval. And again, as I've referred to, there are post-balance sheet events needs to be considered in terms of, again, movements in potential investment values post March 2019 to the date at which we're signing our audit report. And I think it's also worth just noting that the going concern assessment I referred to goes 12 months forward from the date of the audit report. So that needs to go forwards to July 2021. We're also going through additional internal consultation procedures in relation to all of the audit reports that we issue at the moment to ensure that both the disclosures in their accounts are appropriate, but also any reference to those issues in our audit report is appropriate. As I've already said, we're not expecting any modification to our audit report, but we may have some areas where we include what we call as an emphasis of matter, which means that we draw attention to specific disclosures in the pension fund accounts, which we think are important to a reader of those accounts. Finally, we've highlighted that there may be some increases in fees as a result of the additional procedures we've had to undertake in relation to COVID-19. As we're still drawing that work to conclusion, we're not in a position to confirm those yet, but we will do as soon as possible. So I think that's the key areas from the addendum. So I think the only other things are probably the practicalities. We're hoping to be in a position to sign the pension fund accounts next week, subject to the completion of our internal consultation on the audit report, and also subject to the final procedures that we're doing on the cash flow projections and additional information that the council is due to provide us today. Therefore, I think we're asking for delegated authority to be given, and maybe Bill, we want to pick up on this in terms of any final minor wording changes that may be required to those disclosures following the completion of our consultation. I wasn't proposing to say any more in light of particularly the timing that we're on the meeting and the fact that you want to recover some time. As I said, I think it's a very positive report, no significant issues, and we're hoping to be in a position to sign very shortly.
Thank you. Questions for Debbie. Cecile, you're showing your hand up. So do you have a question for Debbie? Okay, fine. So I have no questions either. I thought it was an excellent report. So that brings us back to the accounts. I have to say, I think the format of the accounts was a terrific improvement on last year. I thought whoever's done that should get a serious pat on the back. And the other thing I would just like to note in passing is there's one page that includes KPIs for the administration. And I thought the performance against the KPIs was very, very creditable. So in terms of the accounts, if you take the accounts that have been tabled, there isn't an audit report actually in the accounts, but the text of the audit report's in the ISA that Debbie's provided. So taken together, we've got substantially the accounts, which we're nearly in a position to approve. As Debbie's outlined, there may be some minor changes in the wordings that emerge over the next week. So what I'm going to propose, and we'll need to just take a vote on this, is that we approve the accounts subject to a delegated member in conjunction with myself and the CFO agreeing any non-material changes in the wording. If there's something that was particularly serious, obviously we'd bring it back to the committee. But in terms of what Debbie's outlined, I anticipate that the changes to the wording will not be material in that extent. So we need to actually have a vote on this. So Barbara, would you like to just do the roll call on that for us, please?
Of course. Can I ask the Councillor Cecile Evans-Swift indicates whether she is for or against the...
Can I ask a clarification to the chairman, please? What the chairman, to bring it back in front of the committee, if something happened, what is his judgment? What will he bring it back for? What is the bar of where he will bring it for if it's needed, because we say that if it's material difference, he will bring it on. But do we put a figure on it or not, or do we say it depends of the reason why we have difference? It's a question that has to be raised, but I don't know if I made myself clear there.
Yes, you made yourself perfectly clear. So in my mind, it would be material if it was a change to something that hasn't been raised. So I think the delegated authority would be related to any changes in either going concern or the other matter that Debbie raised. If there are changes outside those, other than non-material changes in wording, then we bring it back to the committee.
So with that, the answer of the chairman, I vote for, please.
Okay. Could I just, sorry, interject just a second? As we are asking for delegated authority, out of the remaining committee members, can we nominate a person to take on this delegation, please?
I can, if you wish.
Do the other committee members agree with that? Excellent. We'll take that as agreed. In which case, with Councillor Irving-Swift indicating her approval, I will move on to Councillor John McGee.
Microphone, John. John, we didn't hear that. I think you're muted.
Right. Can you hear me now, Chair?
We can.
Sorry, that was my inability to press the right button there. I agree, Chair, but given that they asked some recommendations from the audit, especially about declarations, etc., I'm sure the Chair will ensure that that's all put in place before they're signed off. Given that, I'm happy to agree.
Good.
And may I now ask Councillor Osborne to indicate whether he agrees or disagrees with the proposal.
Agreed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we just need to release a couple of our members from their respective cupboards, please.
I shall do that now.
So Bill's back. Oh, right, we're both back. Good. So we can now move on to the E&Y external audit plan. Steve, are you going to speak to this? Steve Withers, yes.
Chair, apologies if I need to leave the meeting because unfortunately I've got a client sign off at midday. So I'll leave Steve and Carol to the rest of the items. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution.
Okay. Yes, Chairman, I'll speak to this, and Carol, please feel free to chip in. It's quite an extensive document. What I'll try and do is I'll focus on the executive summary and leave questions, otherwise I think it's quite a long time. And what this document does is pull together all of the detail of our planning work today, which is pretty well, it's incredibly extensive. And talks you through where we are with that, and also outlines the potential basis for the agreement of fees later on in the document, which
sorry, you echo a lot. Can you do something with your microphone? You echo a lot. Thank you.
Okay, let me try. I'll plug it into this. Bear with me. See if
Yeah, that sounds better.
Ah, there we go. Okay. And obviously we've put a basis for the agreement of fees in with you as well. Again, they are very significant, and I'd expect members to comment on the basis for that proposal, because they are out with how we would normally agree, or how you would typically deal with a local authority set of audit fees. So I'll take you through this, and I'll try and keep it relatively short, and please ask questions. So the first two risks, so I'm on to page 5 of the document, overview of the 1819 audit strategy. The first two risks are the type of risk that you would see in any audit plan. The first being the risk of fraud in revenue and expenditure recognition. And very specifically, we focus that on the incorrect capitalization of revenue, how we deal with revenue through or revenue expenditure, which is funded through capital, and how we deal with cut-off. And the reason we focus on those areas because those are principal ways in which an authority could manipulate or get their number wrong pretty significantly. An area that has previously been of significance to the auditors is the use of capital flexibilities. That is now at a level for the 2018-19 of 2.8 million, and therefore we don't consider that as a significant risk just because of the size of it. Previously, it was a huge point of debate and audit focus. The next area of fraud focuses around misstatements due to fraud and error. There are a number of procedures that we undertake out with that, principally focusing around the use of journals, the risk of management override of controls, etc. But again, there isn't anything that wouldn't have been there previously. Moving now on to some of the more significant areas. For the 1819 audit, we've got the new ERP system in place, ERP Gold. In any major system transfer, that always presents a significant risk, both in terms of the transfer of balances and then in terms of the operation of that system. What we're finding so far is that from a transfer of balances perspective, we're pretty happy, and we know that internal audit have done a lot of work on that, and we've had our own work from our IT auditors, so we're happy with the transfer of balances. And I think we're broadly happy with the actual way that the system's operating. I think that the real challenge here, which is what we're finding and the authority are finding, is that where we're trying to interrogate balances for which information goes back several years in this system, it's requiring the authority to delve back into its previous system and access that information. And that is proving incredibly difficult for the authority to be able to do. And I'm sure Carol can give us some examples, particularly in respect of debtor and creditor balances, which typically are fairly straightforward, but are proving to be less the case in this situation. And principally, that's because the balances that have been transferred are, for want of a better word, not particularly cleansed in the sense of stripping out old and transactions which probably should have been dealt with previously, and that's proving quite problematic in terms of the audit work at the moment. The next two linked areas, again, which have been significant parts of the audit work, are around the valuation of land and buildings and consideration of investment property. Land and buildings always is a significant area of focus for us, and there's a lot of work around that. There's a number of harder to value assets that we need to get to grips with. And linked to that is the valuation and accounting treatment for One Angel Square. Clearly, the transaction in relation to One Angel Square happened in the 1819 year. So we need to get comfortable with that as a transaction, but also the basis of the valuation for it, which has changed between the 17-18 closing position and the 18-19 opening position as a result of the basis. I think broadly speaking, we're happy with the closing position in respect of the base of the valuation. And what we're needing to do is to get more comfortable with that as an opening position. And I'm happy to take any questions on that because it is a very, very specific item for consideration. The next area is around going concern, specifically in terms of the actual assessment of going concern, and then probably, but equally important, more challenging, the actual disclosures in relation to the basis of that going concern assessment. So clearly, there was a lot of work and consideration done in signing off the 17-18 accounts around the basis of going concern. The authority received a £70 million capitalisation directive from the Secretary of State, which in effect enabled you to be able to make that going concern statement. I don't believe that, I therefore think it is a significant risk in terms of our consideration, and equally in terms of the basis of that consideration and the disclosures made. It's equally complicated by two other factors due to the passage of time. So firstly is local government reorganisation, and you've heard a lot about that earlier in the meeting. The authority ceases to exist, but the services of the authority continue, and under a going concern basis, that's generally the basis for a going concern assessment for local authorities. I think the other thing that we do need to also consider, which is new, which is completely unforeseen, is the impact of COVID and the cash position of the authority. Clearly it continues until the 31st of March, and the services continue thereafter. But as with all of our local authorities and any organisation that we're dealing with, we've got a very specific going concern assessment in respect of COVID-19 on an ongoing basis. It is, as I say, it's slightly different for the county because you cease to exist formally as of the 31st of March, but it's something that has come out of the woodwork, which hitherto wouldn't have been here. We move now on to, so all those areas above are what we consider to be significant risks in terms of getting the opinion wrong. They're huge areas of focus for us. We now move on to some areas of higher inherent risk, and you may say, well, what's the difference? The difference is that just by the nature of what we're dealing with in these, there is a risk, an inherent risk of misstatement. We don't think it's probably quite as significant as the areas above, but there's still a lot of work to do on them. So the first of those is in respect of pensions liabilities and asset valuations. You've heard from Debbie in respect of that work. So I'm actually hoping that whilst there's a lot of judgment and assessment in respect of the figures that goes into this pension liability, the actual numbers I think we should be okay with. The recognition and application of grant income, again, we have been doing quite a lot of work with the authority around particularly Section 38 monies, Section 106 monies, and that was an area of consideration from the previous auditors as well. There's an element of judgment and estimation made in recognising those grant incomes, and therefore it's an inherent risk which we focus on. The minimum revenue provision calculation, again, is an area which is the authority has done quite a bit of work on in terms of how it calculates that provision. It's price sensitive. It can change the basis of what goes into your income and expenditure account, and we've done quite a lot of work on that already. And the other area is the fire authority transfer. Again, this is if not quite unique, a very unusual transaction, and it links with the firefighters' pension liability and the transfer of that as well. Therefore, there's quite a bit of assessment to do in those areas. Moving on, private finance initiative. Again, you've very large numbers in the accounts, subject to sensitivity, and our previous experience at other authorities is that small movements in contract and operating arrangements can affect the liability and the asset base quite significantly. Group boundary assessment, and broadly that's other entities that you have. Clearly the authority had a significant number of subsidiaries all over the place. Those have been streamlined down, but what we need to make sure is that we've captured those correctly and that they are in what is the group of Northamptonshire County Council appropriately. A couple of new accounting standards which impact for 1819. FRS 9 is around financial instruments. Principally, those affect how you calculate debtor provisions and other linked areas. And IFRS 15, which is around revenue from contract gain, there is some adjustments we usually have to make for that. And then the other area of higher risk is something that was there in 1718 around exit packages. Again, it's not material in actual volume and value of transactions. They are incredibly sensitive in terms of the nature of them, therefore it's higher risk. And same after moving on to events after reporting date. Clearly we're undertaking the audit significantly after the reporting period. We therefore just need to be cognizant of things that have happened in relation to that. The other area that we have moved to is around materiality. Clearly that is for the authority at probably about our lowest level that we operate to. I won't go into the history of that, but that's broadly where it is. It's very similar to where the previous auditors had it, which we also need to be aware of. And the other thing that I need to formally communicate to you, which is outlined on page 14 or slide 14 of the document, is that for our internal purposes, the authority has been designated as close monitoring due to the risk factors that we outlined there below. I won't go into those. What that means broadly is that internally it is subject to a level of scrutiny and oversight over and above what you would normally be even if you were designated as a major local authority higher risk audit. So you're, putting it fairly bluntly, you're at the higher end of the risk of EY clients designated close monitoring. And that comes with a level of oversight and review, which often the council will not see externally, but it is very clear and apparent to us. The next section kind of details our work and response in respect to those risks. And we then move on to value for money and outline those. Again, I think they're, if I'm being perfectly honest, pretty well rehearsed and straightforward around financial resilience, the basis for children's services, the CQC system, risk management and reorganisation. And at one level, the value for money assessment is a very linear assessment in terms of the opinion, in that it operates from the 1st of April 2018 to the 31st of March 2019. And it's fairly straightforward, if I'm being perfectly honest, as to where I think we'll end up from a from an opinion perspective, because it's all done and dusted. There's nothing that you can do once you get past the 31st of March 19 to impact on that opinion. Materiality we've talked about, and scope of the audit we've talked about, and then the next thing we talk about, team. Timeline clearly has been a significant area of debate. We've had a lot of engagement with the authority, with the commissioners, outside of this committee, with the chairman of the audit committee. We have undertaken, and just to remind committee members, is that we were able to commence the audit in January of this year. That's roughly 15 to 18 months later than we would have started the audit under normal circumstances. That's just a matter of fact. We have undertaken quite a bit of audit work so far. We have had some challenges in respect of that audit work. And those challenges, I think, are several-fold. You know, just the list of issues that I've dealt with are challenging for the authority to deal with, and this is a first-year audit for us, which adds a level of complexity and time that you would normally take. We have agreed with the authority that we will regroup and recommence our detailed work in the autumn with a dedicated team with a view to rolling through the 18-19 audit to a conclusion and then moving straight onto 19-20 to get that concluded as soon as possible and before the 31st of March 2020. Clearly, again, it's obvious that as things move towards the new unitaries, the focus is quite rightly moving forward rather than moving backwards. And that's a you know a challenge for everyone. Our next section focuses on independence. I won't go through that. It's relatively straightforward. The next section is on fees, and I think that this is, I think, a challenging area for us, for the authority and for PSAA, who technically are the contract holder. The basis of how we are going to agree the fee is that, you know, we've undertaken a period of work in terms of familiarisation and some outline work up to the period when KPMG were undertaking the audit in December. We've then undertaken work from the period January to the present time, and that time is in effect on the clock. Those hours are expended, and then we have a period of time where it's in effect an estimation to complete the work that we have at the moment. Our best guess at the moment is that the total audit fee would be in the region of 600,000. We break down the time that we've spent up to January, from January to June, and then the estimation to complete. That is a best guess at the moment. And what we are discussing with the authority and with them through PSAA, who again are the contract holders, is that the best way that we can do this is to be transparent in terms of the hours that it is undertaking and the relevant costs of that, and to share that with the authority on an ongoing basis. I think at that point, Chairman, I've probably spoken for long enough. There is an awful lot in there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Steve. Now, just before I ask for questions from members, Barry, is there any comments or observations you'd like to make at this point?
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. I think, as you would expect, I've spoken closely to Steve and Debbie about the content of the report. And you know, in terms of the major elements, I think Steve's covered off well the items feeding into what's happening on the 18-19 accounts in particular. And I think it's right that we both sides take a step back and regroup. I've put extra resource from the council side with the agreement of the commissioners onto the 18-19 process at a very senior level, and I think that's now starting to pay dividends.
Yeah.
I think in terms of the fee, Steve's right that we need a transparent analysis of what the build-up of that fee is. I can't say at this point in time, but I can simply agree there will be parts of it I will be able to agree with, there'll be other parts I disagree with, but we need to have that dialogue and that process. At that, Chair, I'll leave it.
Okay, thank you. So I'll ask for questions in a minute, but I'll jump in first with a couple for you, Steve. I'll ask both questions, then you can respond to them.
Yeah.
So there are some items that you referred to which I'd regard as judgmental issues. For example, the treatment of One Angel Square, the MRP issue, and I think Section 38 is probably another one.
Yeah.
Now, I would have thought that these are now at the level where the debate is between you and Barry. And so what I would find particularly helpful is bearing in mind the back end of the year for the committee is going to be very busy because we're going to be approving these accounts and then the accounts for the following year, is if in September you could, in your update report, deal with these three issues, because then, you know, subject to anything, we can then take those off the table. So that's point one.
Yeah.
Point two is a bit technical about going concern.
Yeah.
I just want to understand how this is going to be done, because we could spend an awful lot of time spinning wheels on this if we're not careful. Normally what would happen is Barry and his team would produce a financial forecast which would cover probably 12 or 18 months from the date on which you sign the accounts. This year, that's going to be a real challenge because we're going to be doing this review in December. Barry will be able to forecast the first 3 months of that period, and he'll be accountable for it. But the balance of the period is actually going to be made from the budgets of the new unitaries. Barry may or may not know what the figures are, but he'll have no accountability for them. Yeah. So you may not yet have actually worked out how precisely you're going to deal with this, but would you like to make any comment in relation to that?
Yeah, Chairman, that's a really valid point that you raise, and it is one which we are seeing in different contexts, not necessarily local government, but one, for example, if you've got a number of clinical commissioning groups coming together in the health sector, merging into one with them, not, you know, where in effect the legacy authority either has already disappeared or disappears on the 31st of March. So it's not without parallels. So where I think we get to on this, and we've already kind of trodden this path part of the way, so I don't think this is entirely new, is that I expect, and how we're dealing with this is that subject to where the new authority is in terms of its funding arrangements, we will have either some form of emphasis of matter paragraph in the audit opinion, and broadly what that says is we have looked at the basis of going concern. We agree with management's assessment and the council's assessment that it is in the context of the services will continue and will be funded, and here's the basis for the funding and here's the cash. And we conclude that, but we're drawing your attention to the fact that because of reorganisation and then you've got COVID linking to that, which again is challenging authorities, it's a huge big issue, and therefore we draw your attention to the basis of that. The next step you go to, which is possibly more likely to be the point of debate, is around material uncertainty in respect of going concern. And that arises where you've got a not dissimilar assessment. However, the sources of funding available and the actual physical cash and the availability of that at the point of signing those accounts is not as certain. So it may be because the budgets haven't been agreed, it may be because it could be for a variety of reasons, but it is not possible for the authority to demonstrate to us that it's going to have the cash in the bank and the cash flows are going to be necessary to fund its position. And therefore the council at that point makes some type of material uncertainty judgment in respect of those accounts going forward, and we concur with that and have a material uncertainty paragraph in our audit opinion. The other stage you go to is that the authority is not a going concern, and therefore it isn't going to exist, and neither its services, and I don't think we're there because clearly the services are statutory in nature. They have to be provided. Someone has to provide them in some way, shape or form. So I think it will land between those first two.
Good. Okay. So obviously not to prejudge that, but just to make an appeal to minimise any spinning of the wheels, because certainly last year on going concern, I think a lot of money was spent. And I think in the generality, in the context of local government accounting, it's probably one of the lower value-added elements of the audit, shall we say. And on the other point I raised, I think you nodded, so I'm expecting that we'll be able to clear in principle the judgmental issues in September.
Yeah, I think we're a long way on with a number of those issues already. I think I would say, Chairman, and you'll have seen even in the last 24 hours, lots of talk of Section 1414 notices being issued around the sector. That of itself probably ups the ante around the nature of that going concern assessment a little bit more than it would hitherto. You're quite right, typically it wouldn't have been the case, but actually in the context of local government out with Northampton's specific circumstances, those issues are being trailed. And therefore, I think that assessment is more in play than it may have been previously. But I understand your take on it, and I get the point.
Good. So, members, any questions for Steve? Good. Okay. Well, thank you for the presentation and the comprehensive documentation, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in September. Now, we need to note Steve's report. Again, we'll do this by affirmation. Does anybody object to noting Steve's report? Perfect. So we'll note that, and we'll move on to an item which I think we can deal with very quickly, which is the counter fraud policies review. This is really essentially just a closing the circle. I'm just checking here. Duncan's online. Do you want to just make a couple of very brief comments on this item?
Thank you, Chair. Just checking everybody can hear me. I am unmuted.
You are.
Thank you. The policies are resubmitted to the committee. The committee has seen these policies before and prior to them going into the formal approval process. Cabinet have now approved those policies, so they're then recirculated to the committee so that you have sight of those approved policies. They do reflect best practice. We are always, of course, for a policy decision, mindful that they are time limited around the closure of NCC. Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Good. So we can give ourselves a little pat on the back for having raised that in the first place. Everybody or anybody not content to note Duncan's report? Thank you. So let's move on to the item 10, which is the internal audit plan. Jacinta, I think you're going to speak to this. Would you like to take us through the relevant bits of your report? I think you probably need to unmute.
Right. Thank you, Chair. Happens quite a lot. The plan this year, we did anticipate that the plan would be different from previous years in order for it to take proper account of assurances required, obviously, for the transition of the council into the 2 unitary. The level of change, coupled obviously with the onset of the pandemic crisis and the unique challenges that that has created, brings us a layer of uncertainty and heightened risks across all areas of the council. And that, to an extent, has impacted our ability to plan and predict sort of areas of coverage within sort of the 9 months that's left of the county council. The plan we're presenting, therefore, has to be even more dynamic than usual and needs to be sufficiently flexible, obviously, to enable assurance to be provided, not just on current risks, but also to allow for emerging risks to be addressed as the year progresses. As explained at section 4.5 and 4.6 on page 4 of the report, these uncertainties does mean that the current plan is very much an indicative plan, which is going to be subject to change throughout the year. The key points of note I'd like to take members to the detailed plan, pages 19 to 15, where we obviously have a focus on key financial systems. We also include a review of the robustness of closed down arrangements. And these 2 areas we think are fairly key, important for the foundation of the formation of the new authorities. We also attempt to include a review of COVID-19 response of the authority, as we feel that would impact going forward for the authority. And also some basic IT reviews, because obviously everybody's working from home and a lot of digital security issues might well arise. So we're planning to have a look at some basic IT security things. That's kind of all I'd like to say, Chair. I would welcome feedback or any suggestions from members if they want to email me some ideas or any sort of comments they want to make on the report. And I'll welcome any questions.
So members, any questions for Jacinta on this report? Okay, well, it's obviously clearly a very fluid situation, and I take from this you anticipate at the minute you are going to have enough resources to complete the programme, and I expect that when we see you again in September, it's possible that we could be seeing quite a materially different document depending on how circumstances arise over the next 3 or 4 months.
That's good.
Okay, thank you for that. So again, we need to note Jacinta's report. Any members not happy to note that report? Oh, sorry, Cecile, you've got a question, I think. You're on mute.
Yeah. Yes, Chairman, you said it. The problem is at the moment, which Jacinta was saying, I think in September, it's the time to have a pause and look truly and question, because at the moment it's so fluid that it doesn't really make sense to add to the workload. But in September, I think that is where we can be a bit more focused on what needs to be done.
Yeah, and also there is the point in September that there's no point doing an audit if it hasn't added value, unless it's a probity audit or that sort of thing. So perfect, thank you for that. So we'll now move on to the internal audit progress update, which I think, Steve, you're going to talk to. If we could just deal with your report first, and we'll then deal with the limited opinion audits one by one after that.
Yeah, that's fine, Chair. The internal audit update, it covers the Q4 period. So I just wanted to pick up really 3 key areas within that. Firstly, the progress against the 2019-20 audit plan. As at the end of April, 59% of the agreed plan was either at draft or final report stage. The performance primarily reflects the decision to suspend the 19-20 internal audit plan when the lockdown occurred. towards the end of March. Just to provide some context around that, at the time of the suspension, there was 30 audits still to be completed. Of those, 22 had already started, with 8 at the point where the fieldwork had been completed and with just the report outstanding. I think it's also worth noting, based on a question raised previously about resources, that around half of those 30 audits were being delivered by resources outside of the NCC internal audit team from across the wider LGSS audit teams based in Milton Keynes and Cambridge. Whilst at the time the plan was suspended, there was still a considerable amount of work to complete before the end of April. We did anticipate that a significant number of those audits would have been completed by the end of April. At your request, I won't talk about the audits that have been completed because we'll then go on to those and discuss in a moment. The next section I just wanted to refer to was around follow-ups. So in terms of that, the results are included for the committee's attention. My only real comment on that is that the results need to be considered in the context of the update included in the corporate tracker further on in the agenda, especially in relation to the 28 actions not implemented. The point I just want to make with that is specifically in seeking an update from managers, the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown has been put forward as a reason why certain actions have not been implemented by the agreed deadline. Just to reassure members that we've agreed a revised date for those, and in general, most officers we spoke to understood the importance of what they were trying to do. It was just that other things had taken over priority, so the deadline itself was just no longer feasible. The final section I just wanted to cover then was the fraud and corruption section. It's quite a detailed section, but I just wanted to raise a couple of points. Firstly, I just wanted to refer members to section 5.4.1 and 5.4.2, which provide details of 2 cases where fraud and error has been identified. And there's a narrative there to provide an explanation for one of the fraud cases. Read the case of the £53,000 overpayment. We will provide further information once the issue has been fully considered. I've also been asked by the Chief Internal Auditor to raise a specific fraud case that's not included within our update report. NCC has been the subject of a bank mandate fraud with a financial impact of just over £90,000. A bank mandate fraud is where a fraudster impersonates a supplier and requests that the council make payments to a different, generally a fraudulent, bank account. It's a common type of fraud with varying degrees of sophistication, but where council systems should be sufficient to prevent such attempts. And that includes that you don't just take the word of the correspondent, you contact core details, the original details from the supplier to make sure that they have sent that information. Like with all systems, it's not possible to guarantee with 100% certainty that controls can prevent all such attempts. However, the incident highlighted that controls were not operating at the required level. In this case, checks were indication, but not to the required levels, and the fraud was sadly successful. Changes have been made to improve protection in this area, including procedural clarity, further checks and staff awareness training. It's also worth noting that there's been 2 further attempts of this type of fraud in the last few months as well, which have both been prevented. In terms of the case itself, liaison continues with the police to progress recovery, but we have to be realistic that it is considered unlikely we will get the money back. Just want to make a final point on this, that this type of fraud is also sometimes attempted for payroll transactions in the same way where a employer's details are asked, bank account details have to be changed. And just wanted to point out that a recent attempt at MCC was successfully prevented due to the correct application by staff on the relevant system controls. Like phishing emails, this continues to be an ongoing challenge to councils nationally. So at that point, I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Steve on that section of his report? Cecile?
Yes, if I understand Steve properly, now you are much more satisfied that we can stop the fraud. The process is much better, which is always a risk to the council. So are you satisfied that now on audit, you have the proper procedure in place? Thank you.
I think I'd probably say that we thought the proper procedure was in place all along, because this isn't really a new issue. The real issue here is more the application in terms of officers who are doing the checks, making sure they do the checks as requested and as outlined. As long as they do that, and it's been demonstrated in some of the other examples, it does stop the fraud from happening. But the one thing around this is the fraudsters are getting better and better, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated. So going back a few years, it was relatively easy sometimes to identify an error or chiffon. I think it's about check and check again from an audit perspective.
Yep. Steve, I've just got one question on the suspended audits. Now, as you were indicating, quite a few of these audits you'd already done the field work. Some of them you probably even nearly got to draft report stage. So you would have created quite a lot of added value and learning from those audits. So has this been documented so that the value of the work that you've done to date isn't lost?
Primarily within the plan for 2021 that Jacinta's just talked about, I've requested, and it's within there, that we're going to try and finish some of those audits within reasonable grounds. Now, what we don't know at this point is what that means by finish those audits. For me, I've just got to make sure that the findings at the time reflect the findings as now. So it might not be the formal audit report that we've utilised and that you'll see for the other audits that we're just about to discuss, but there will be at least a formal document issued to management with at least some of the key findings, and for us a focus on what are the must-do improvements that must be done before we move to unitary.
Thank you. Bill, you got a question?
Yes, can I just ask, going back to fraud and the issue that we were talking about for the 90K, is it possible to work with the LGA or other authorities like that, organisations like that, so that we can actually talk, make other councils aware, or they can actually issue information to try and stop it happening to other councils?
There is already that mechanism in place. So just to provide context to the example, this company wouldn't have just targeted Northampton County Council. They would likely have sent the email or the request to change account details to every local authority in the country. And what they're just hoping for is they can get through with a number of suppliers. In some cases, they might be sending through requests for suppliers that don't even deal with that local authority. I'm also aware that through, I think it's called the National Audit Fraud Network, they're referred to as NAFA. This is kind of like a hot topic. It's always on people's agendas. It's one of those ones where the controls and the systems and the checks have been built into, I would say, every authority's checking process. It's just sometimes it's that application. And of course, you only consider the application in terms of the robustness of some of those checks, sadly, when something goes wrong. But there is general learning, there is contact between fraud colleagues at both a local and a national level to make sure they're all aware of these type of issues.
Thank you, Steve. Well, looks like there's no other questions. So shall we just fairly quickly step through the limited opinion audit report? So general ledger is the one that comes up first for us.
Yeah, so these are all covered in the appendices 2 to 5. I want to more focus on in the comments within the update report, because as part of this process, because some of the audits have been completed recently, some of them a few months ago, we asked, in conjunction with NLT, requested this as well, was we asked for updates from the services. So just picking up initially with the general ledger, contextually for this, but members need to understand this was actually not a 2019-20 audit, this was a 2018-19 audit, which just took a lot of time to finalise because there was lots of scrutiny over this, given some of the issues that we've talked about previously. The context of this bit is whilst the report was only finalised in March, finance colleagues didn't wait for the audit report to be finished. So the audit raised 3 main issues, and I'm pleased to report that improvements have been made in all 3 areas. So just picking them up individually, our first concern was around who could make changes to the charts of accounts or who could approve changes. A revised list of officers has now been agreed, a much smaller number list of senior finance people. And as part of the work on the 2019-20 audit, before it was suspended, we concluded that that was operating as intended. So all the new requests that were tested had gone through with this new authorization. The second issue was around auto approval access to journals. So just for members' information, when a journal is processed on the ledger, it is generally accepted that it's processed by an individual and then independently checked by somebody else. Over the years, systems have built in controls where they've allowed that flexibility to be adaptive for certain users. And so if a finance professional, for example, is doing it, what is the value of actually someone checking what they're doing was questioned. So we understood the functionality. The problem we had was when the audit in 2018-19, over 200 officers had this access. And it didn't appear to us that it had been based on any kind of formal assessment, especially involving key finance officers from NCC. Again, pleased to report that the number is reduced from 205. It's actually gone further than what's in the report. It's now down to 74. The access now is kind of like limited to suitably experienced, qualified finance and system teams officers. Talking to finance colleagues, they are still not happy with 74, and there is significant scrutiny over this. And anyone who wants this access now has to kind of like go through a justification to get that. The final area was probably the biggest area in the report, which was around control accounts. And it's fair to say that this area has just been completely reviewed by finance colleagues. So since the last year, comprehensive procedures are now in place. Clear roles and responsibilities are in place, which means that everybody knows who's responsible for which control accounts. Appropriate monitoring arrangements in place. And just taking on board one of the comments I think Barry made earlier, there's actually been additional resourcing put in this area as well to make sure that all the activity is being completed. I think from my perspective, Chair, this is a positive audit now in terms of the action taken by management to address the audit findings. So at that point, I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, you can certainly claim a success with that particular audit. So any questions on the general ledger audit? Okay, if you want to just move on to the M&E audit.
Yeah, this is a bit of a weird audit, so bear with me on this one. As members will know, we give an audit opinion on all our pieces of work. I was the manager who reviewed this audit originally, and I proposed, which was something agreed by Duncan, that on this case we wouldn't give an audit opinion. The reason for this is that we found kind of like 2 arrangements in place. An element of our audit is always looking back at arrangements previously and in the previous year. And so when we did the audit and started the audit, when we look backwards, we found weaknesses in all aspects of contract management, but especially in terms of the lack of robust checks over payments and a void in terms of performance management of the contractor. By the time we started the audit, and I don't normally like to name names, but I think in this case I would want to, the Strategic Estates Manager, Schools and PFI had taken over acting contract manager on a temporary basis because the post was now vacant. And he'd already started, well, I think he'd already realised that what was in place was inadequate, and he'd already taken action to make sure new arrangements in place for when the contract changed in November 2019. It was always our plan, this is from the internal audit perspective, for us to go in and do a follow-up just to make sure that those new arrangements were embedded within the new contract. But sadly, COVID-19 has meant that that has been suspended, but it is something that it's not a massive piece of work, and I will be in discussions with officers to pick up in the once we get back to the new normal. So again, at this point, any questions?
Okay, I just had one question on this, which is a question you can't really answer, but it bothered me a little bit because it seemed to be quite a poor situation that had emerged. And it just made me wonder, are there any other areas that you're concerned about in the context of moving to the new unitaries? Because, clearly this wouldn't have passed any safe and secure review, would it? So any other areas that you're worried about that you're going to be working on over the next few months?
I think, in being honest with you, Chair, any area that's not been audited before worries me, because what we've found in my time here over the last 3 years is that audit areas where it haven't been subject to audit in the past is generally where we found quite big weaknesses. We are generally comfortable around, our focus really would be around the major contracts, and we'll move on to the highways one next. And I think we also have planned work around things like school PFI. We are, within the 2019-20 plan, we've got around a number of contracts to make sure that arrangement's in place. I think as part of the 2021 plan and the ongoing discussions with senior officers, I think it will be one of the key areas of discussions around where they believe as well, and we can triangulate what we believe and what they believe to focus on a number of more areas. I think it's fair to say that contract management is an area, and not just linked to Northampton, but in my experience in the public sector, that when it's an area that kind of like isn't best practice in all places at the moment. So what you find is you find good areas and not so good areas. And one of the discussions that always comes back to is about adequate resourcing. But yes, so there will be work going on this year around that area.
Okay, good. So Jacinta, maybe when you come back in September, one of the things you could address, because you will not be able to audit everything, but it will be interesting to know those areas where you've thought about it and decided for reasons of resources or lower risks that actually you're not going to cover those areas.
Okay.
So let's move on to highways, and let me emphasize, actually, this is not a limited opinion audit. It's here because the previous audit was...
sorry, forgive me for interrupting, Chairman. Councillor Irvin Swift would like to make a point.
Sorry. Thank you. Jacinta.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, Stephen said that he is not comfortable for anything that has not been audited or whatever. When he makes that statement, because I am maybe just a year on the audit committee, what is the amplitude of not being audited? If it's 20%, 30%, what is his assessment? Because when he said he's not comfortable with what has not been audited, what is the level of comfortable he is in? Because that is the point of audit. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of that, Councillor, my answer really reflects that as an auditor, until I've audited an area, anything that I would be saying would be based on assumptions. So I don't want to give members assurances without me having the evidence. It's just the way I think most auditors operate. We have built into the plan more and more work over the last few years around contract management and things like that. I think it's just a recognition that there's hundreds of contracts in place. So I think it goes back to all points, is from an audit perspective, we can't focus on every individual activity. It's more to do with the key activity, and then where we can triangulate with management where they have concerns. The one thing, just to give context to that, management for me now are more keen to pick the phone up and say, we've got a problem, can you help us from an audit perspective? So we find that as a positive. I can't speak beforehand, but about that kind of relationship, but all I can say now is that people very much come to us with, I think I've got a problem, can you have a look into it? And things like that. So again, within the context of all these reports that we discussed, it is worth pointing out that a lot of them are driven by management requests. Yeah, so it's not that management management have concerns, they just like Audit to kind of like present them to them so that they've got a list of key actions that they need to focus on, rather than having to do it all themselves and get that independence and things like that. So it's all about key contracts for us, and our plan of work covers most of those.
Thanks, Stephen. Your little blue hand has disappeared now, Cecile, so I'll be able to spot when you've got a question. So moving on to the highways, I was just saying that this is actually not a limited opinion audit, but I asked for it to be included for two reasons. One was that the preceding audit that was done probably 3 years ago was limited opinion, and also it's an area of interest to colleagues on the scrutiny committee, and it seemed to me that it was a document that was worth putting into the public domain. So with that as background, Steve, would you like to comment on this particular audit?
Yeah, just on top of that, it's also an audit area that has got interest of senior officers. So the chief exec in particular has provided some input on this audit, and I know the new director in place is very keen that the improvements identified are made. But taking on board your introduction, this audit is a kind of like partly a follow-up of the 2017 audit, 17-18 audit. And then just in terms of progress of that, of the 7 recommendations made in that report, 3 had been fully implemented, with a further 2 judged as part implemented. The latest review was only finalised in May 2020, and did identify a number of weaknesses, again, some that we'd raised previously, but some different ones to that. We give you an update included in the report, but it is only a month since the audit was finalised. The key action within this is we've got a follow-up planned for September. Well, we did have a follow-up plan for September, and we're still hoping to do that. But I will be touching base with officers on a monthly basis on this audit, because from more of a proactive point of view, I want to be prepared for when the chair asks me questions on this audit going forward. So there's lots of, this will also be monitored, of course, through NLT, through the corporate tracker that we're just about to discuss. But there's lots of oversight of this, but we are keen that the improvements are made for this, especially given the move to unitaries.
Okay, any questions on the highways audit? Thank you. So Steve, just finally on the children's social care transport one.
Yeah, so just to provide context to this, this audit was not originally in our plan. It came out of concerns raised by senior officers around specific concerns. You will see from the audit report that we identified a number of significant weaknesses, which basically indicated a lack of control over how transport was being requested and then monitored from the NCC side in particular. So just provide context to this. At the time of this audit, all the requests were processed through the council, but it was Kier WSP who were administering the requests. So what the audit really concluded was there was a lack of control at the council end around how this arrangement was in place. Again, to provide some context, a project group had been set up to work alongside the audit. So there was already a recognition that there was problems in this area, especially given, I think, the increase in spend in this area and things like that. And so whilst the audit's only been finalised less than a month, a significant amount of action has already been taken. So a draft policy has been produced, it's been approved by CFN leadership team, and it's just now out for consultation with key stakeholders. One of the key areas within this as well is around the issue of when does the council provide transport in the context of if someone's with a foster carer, is it the council's responsibility or is it the foster carer's responsibility to arrange transport? So linked to that, there's been a revised foster carer payments process has been implemented in April, and a further review of the policy and payment agreement is due for completion and implementation by September. Other progress has been made in terms of a new request and approval process is currently being piloted within children's. A new IT system has been commissioned to support transport, with two key aims from an audit perspective to address some of the findings, which is improvements to the payment process and better management information. And fundamentally as well, at the same time as all that's gone on, Children's have also undertaken a review of all their records and a review of all their requests for social care funded transport, generally to school, for 2021. So they've done an audit assessment to make sure that those requests are needed and agreed a way forward for all of those requests. Again, following on from my previous comment about the positive relationship that we have with areas, the assistant director who's leading on this has specifically requested that we go back in August to assess what they've done, but also to give them a view on whether some further action is needed. So again, it's a positive from us that they're not just asking us to tell them what's wrong, but they're asking us to come back in and at the end of it and say, does it actually improve the systems and controls from an audit perspective? So again, this is a real positive for us because in a 5-6 week period since the audit's been finalised, the service has pretty much addressed most things with a plan to get it sorted out within the next couple of months. Again, any questions on that at this point?
Bill, you've got a question? And then Stephen.
Yes, one of the major concerns I've had for a long time is with regards to home to school transport and how much money that with the county it costs the county council. And on page 7 of your report, 5.4, the third bullet point, again, it alludes to the home to school transport policy. With so many, well, all the secondary schools in Northamptonshire now are academies, and about half the infant junior schools are academies. How much effort are we putting into making sure that academies, where appropriate, do actually contribute to this in a significant way, rather than it being the county council who pays for it?
Sadly, I can't answer that, Councillor, because this audit was specifically around social care transport. So this was around transport being provided where children are in our care or in the care system. The question that I think is more relevant is what I think internal audit will want to do in the next coming weeks, months, is understand how the findings from this review would be considered in something like home to school transport. So are the findings applicable? So going back to your point, is the council paying for transport that it should be providing, and asking those questions of whether they have more effective systems in place. So I think it's likely that we will have contact with managers in that area, and whether an audit might be needed in that area will be one of those considerations. But in terms of your specific question, not in a position to answer it because it wasn't within the scope of this audit.
Stephen, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. Reading through the report, it seems a very sort of convoluted way to define the costs and everything for children's transport. I wondered how it evolved that Kia actually got involved. Wouldn't it make much more sense if it was done directly between the providers and children's social care department, or is it just a question of allocating budgets? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sadly, again, I'm not probably in a position to answer the question in the specific detail you require. My understanding is that this service was originally provided through the council, and then as part of a move to use Kia on certain services, this area was transferred out. I think, again, it links to some of the issues we've been talking about contract management. What it becomes at that point is how effectively we manage that relationship as a council. And I think what this report has identified is that people probably haven't asked the right questions at the right time. I'm pleased to say those questions are now being asked, and whilst some of them might have been prompted by the audit, it was very clear to us that Children's had already realised that this was an area they needed to focus in. And so, hence their setup of the project group probably already realised that this was a priority, at least in 2019-20.
Any more questions on that report? Oh, John, sorry.
Sure, I did put my little hand up. Unfortunately, I didn't see it. I thought that's where we should do these meetings. But I've got a couple of questions, if I may. I agree with the key input. It should directly be run by the county council, and then perhaps we would have named people responsible. But it says on the plan, the management action plan, that most of the things should be done by June 2020. Have most of them been implemented? Especially, if I may finish, Stephen.
Yeah.
You did mention that you have had a policy and it's out for consultation. I'm disappointed and actually disgusted that we didn't have a policy, because these are the most vulnerable people that we look after, children in care. So that's not very good in the first place, and I'm glad that's been sorted. In fact, when we look at that policy and the other issues, how do we ensure that message is put forward into the new unitaries? Because what we don't want to do is lose any of the stuff that's been identified, and we can ensure that we have value for money and look after vulnerable people. The other one was, we need a very strong policy on passenger assistance. These children have already had a very difficult time and a hard life, moved about, etc. And passenger assistance is extremely important for the children themselves. Does that need a full look at, given that a part of the policy just for that?
Okay, thank you, Councillor. In terms of the actions, in terms of the update, within the report of the update report that we've given, a management update was provided probably at the beginning of June. We're pleased that most of the actions have been implemented. There's an acknowledgement within a couple that the impact of COVID-19 or the lockdown might have delayed these, but we're pretty positive that the action that they've taken addresses, if not all the findings, the majority of the key findings at this stage. In terms of the moving to the unitary, we would expect any lessons from this to be embedded in practice before it goes to unitary. So in the transition to unitary, I wouldn't imagine that we would expect, I mean, without knowing how it works in terms of the detail, and I know Paul did his presentation earlier, we would expect in most cases the systems to be just transferred across as is, unless there's an identified, transformational activity. So what we would expect to see is that by the time this goes to unitary, the new arrangements are embedded in practice and then transferred across. Hence why we want to do, and the service has requested, another audit to make sure that actually what they've done works. So again, that's a positive from our perspective. In terms of passenger assistance, totally agree. Basically, we just found that there was again, going back to your point about the lack of policy, we couldn't believe there was no guidance on the use of passenger assistance. The approach that seemed to be adopted was, if in doubt, use a passenger assistant, which was like a kind of like a risk-averse approach. We didn't disagree with that from an audit perspective, but of course we expect people to follow against a policy or a procedure. And the question we were raising was, well, what is it? And within that, what we found was that Kia had been given a briefing note going back about 5 or 6 years, and no one in NCC was aware of it. So they were working to a process. And so what it's all about within our thing is clarity. And then whoever agrees the policy, we're assuming that the people agreeing the policy are the people who have the knowledge and the understanding to do that. Well, in doing that, they make the decision based on what should be best practice. At the moment, it was just so informal that it was, if you wanted a passenger decision, just give it. Or, if not, if you hadn't thought of it, maybe, it might have been missed. So all we were looking for was structure, which kind of underpins all the work we do. We look for policy procedure to underpin the daily activity of services.
Any more questions or comments for Stephen on his report? Barry?
Just to clarify on the response to Councillor McGee there, as we move forward in the unitary, you'll actually have the Children's Trust who delivers children's social care services. So we'll make sure that any of the actions and the responsibilities on the servant side are actually picked up by the Trust as part of their contract. Clearly, the transport issues will carry forward in the unitary. But in terms of children's social care, the expectation is that the Trust will deliver that.
Thank you, Barry.
Okay, so we need to note this report in passing. I must say that this report for me, demonstrates massive improvement over the last few years in the engagement between internal audit and the organisation and the added value that's created. And that's great credit to the internal audit team, but it's also a credit to the management team who, in my mind, continuously demonstrate their willingness to engage positively with internal audit. So that's very good. So having made that comment, does anybody disagree that we should note this report? Perfect. So we'll note that report and we can now move on to the annual governance statement. Duncan, I think you're going to speak to this one.
Thank you, Chair. The annual governance statement for members of the...
Sorry, I do apologise for interrupting. We actually have the Assistant Director for Corporate Services online now, who's joining us for items 13 and 14. She can only be with us for a limited time, so I don't know whether you would consider reorganising the agenda or whether this item will be rather sort of a short one in nature.
Duncan, see, oh, there you are. You've moved on my screen. Duncan, this is only going to be 2 minutes, isn't it?
I hope so, Chair, yes.
Right, so just carry on. We'll do the 2 minutes, then we can move on to Kerry's items.
Okay. For members who are new to this, the annual governance statement is actually part of the council's accounts. So it is a document that forms part of those accounts. It actually remains a draft document that can be changed until the accounts are fully audited and signed off. The document is brought together by internal audit, hence I'm introducing it, but its content must be owned by the council as a whole, and ultimately it's signed off by the chief exec and the leader. By its nature, it has to focus on the defined accounts of period. So for the AGS we're looking at now as a draft, it's for the period the 1st of April 2018 to the 31st of March 2019. It does, however, have to reflect significant recent events. So there is a section in the report that looks at those issues that are post-dated March 2019. Annual governance statements by their nature are often very dry documents. I don't think this is any different, but they provide an important summary of the governance processes and controls applied across the council's activities. It's a draft document brought to the audit committee to give committee members an opportunity to familiarise themselves with the governance arrangements as documented, but also gives the committee members that opportunity to raise any queries or questions about what is articulated in the document. And even before the prompt chair that Kerry is now with us for later items, I was going to say that for this particular item, I think it might be more appropriate if members of the committee engage with me via email or phone outside the meeting to discuss the content rather than a Q&A during the meeting that I think could get us into a bit too much detail and deflect the meeting from its timetable. At that point, I pause and hopefully I've stuck to those 2 minutes.
Good, yeah, no, I agree with that because this is essentially a draft to let us know what it's likely to look like. You know, if members can engage with it, as they say, we'll be coming back to this again much later on in the year. On that basis, are members happy to note that report? Okay, noted. So we can now move on to the item 13, which relates to the COVID-19 risk review. I'm very, very happy that Kerry's made the time to join us. Much appreciate that. The point here by way of background is that it's clearly a very dynamic situation and it's not appropriate for anybody to be reviewing actual risk management and how it's gone. But it is entirely appropriate for us to understand what the process is for applying risk management in the context of this particular event. So Duncan, you're the author of the report. Would you like to start off, or are you going to delegate to Kerry straight away?
I think I'd start off and give a précis of what is in the report, because one of the tasks, Chair, you asked was for me as Chief Internal Auditor to cast my eye across those risk management processes. And then I'd pause and allow Kerry to add any contribution that she might want to make. If I dive straight in, I think as you rightly highlight, Chair, it's not appropriate that we look at any specific risk. The council is dealing, it goes without saying, council is dealing with unprecedented pressures derived from COVID-19. And within that, as I set out, paragraph 4.3 of the report, it's very important to recognise that the last 3 or 4 months represent unprecedented pressures on services. It would not be appropriate to assess those actions applying a benefit of hindsight either now or in a few months' time. And the council was and remains rightly reliant on service expertise to manage those issues, often at very short notice. So this was very much a light touch review, and I'm very grateful to the time that Kerry has taken to walk me through and provide the information that has allowed that review. To give my opinion, the evidence I think that we've reviewed gives the committee assurance that the risks arising from COVID-19 are and have been managed in a structured way, which is very reassuring. The existing risk data from the risk register prior to COVID-19 pressures has also been subject to review in the light of COVID-19 issues. And the current methodology being applied around risk provides for periodic reflection and learning on an ongoing basis. So very much the risk management principles have not been lost during this period. They've remained very valuable and visible to NLT, and indeed used across NLT to better help the management of COVID-19 pressures and understand their impact on existing risk management issues. So I'm happy to give assurance to the committee that those processes are getting the right level of attention and assurance through NLT. And another compliment to Kerry, the grip that Kerry applies to that on behalf of NLT, I found very impressive in collating those issues across NLT members and the services of the council. So if Kerry can bask in those compliments, I'm sure she might want to make a contribution at that point.
Kerry, I can't see a picture of you, but I know you're there. So would you like to just add anything to Duncan's report, or would you like to just leave it with his parting comments?
No, can everybody hear me? I was having trouble with my mic yesterday, so that's good. But thank you, Duncan, for those kind words. The only thing I would seek to add really is that just to give you sort of further reassurance about what we will be doing moving forward. As you can see from the report that Duncan put together, there's an interesting context for this, because you'll know from previous audit reports, business continuity and emergency planning has been under some scrutiny in the past, and certainly the testing of the critical incident plan was one of the things that we had as an outstanding action. I can definitely say we tested the critical incident plan in anger, and actually there's a huge amount of learning that has come from that. In terms of the risk management processes, there's obviously some detail here about the fact that we've maintained a comprehensive risk register across what we call in emergency planning terms, each of the cells, all the structures and teams that are working across the incident. But NLT has basically stepped up right from the outset to initially daily meetings, and we're still running twice weekly meetings in addition to our normal weekly NLT meetings that are all COVID focused, and obviously a lot of those are about assessing ongoing risks and making sure that things are actioned and dealt with as swiftly as possible. There is also a risk management process across the incident management through the whole system, so with our other local resilience forum partners, and there's also been a considerable amount of external scrutiny around what we're doing. So up until very recently, we had ministerial input into our weekly, and as it was originally, twice weekly strategic coordination group meetings. We have MHCLG representation, and there's been ministerial calls frequently. So we've been under the spotlight and scrutiny to see how the county has stood up in terms of its emergency planning arrangements. And we've had lots of positive feedback to the point now where that sort of national scrutiny and oversight has been stepped down, because they're confident that what we're doing is appropriate. But as part of that, each of the LRFs have had to submit daily returns about different parts of the incident response, from management of PPE to management of excess deaths and mortuary space, etc. And they've gone in in a number of different formats, at least well, for most of them on a daily basis, some of them slightly less. And so that scrutiny is there at a national level as well. And we then, as a result of that, have produced a heat map that goes to the tactical and strategic groups every week to manage risk across the system. So this report focused mainly on NCC risk management, but there is actually a broader system in play as well in terms of the COVID response. And moving forward, as you can imagine, there's already been a number of debrief and lessons learned type of activity that's gone on. So the LRF commissioned a review by the University of Northampton about a month in to the incident, which we took some learning around our strategic command and control arrangements. And there is now a comprehensive debrief being run across the whole system through police and fire colleagues, which we're waiting for the feedback. And then obviously across the local authorities, we are looking at what we have learned in terms of our service delivery and where we've changed services, and where we want to continue some of those positive steps that we've taken to deal with the incident and continue them for the future. So all of that needs to get wrapped up into what we would call in business continuity terms a post-incident review. And that report has been started and will be further worked on over the coming weeks and months. And then I'm sure in due course will be brought before you. Has anybody got any particular questions?
So questions for Duncan or Kerry in relation to the report? Good. Well, I'm sure we'll have loads of questions when we get to the review of the incident later on, but I think that's very good that we can rely on Duncan's assurance and your further comments, Kerry, that risks have been managed and documented well. So we need to note that report. Everybody happy we note it? Perfect. Thanks, Kerry. You're going to stay on, I think, for this final item, which is the action tracker. Now, just by way of introduction, the action tracker is something that we look at normally in respect of internal audit actions. And this item started off with me saying to Duncan, now, would you engage with management and get them to say which of the agreed actions they won't be able to fulfill in the light of COVID challenges and unitary work and everything else that's going on? To which the answer came, actually, we're going to do them all. It might just take us a little bit longer. And that's what's reflected in the action tracker. The second thing that came was, because the query was related purely in relation to the internal audit tracker, the second question was, second observation, sorry, from management was that not only are you going to get the internal audit action tracker, which is the one you've got here physically in the papers for those of you who've got them, but you're going to get all the other action trackers as well. So if you go on the website, you'll be able to see the action trackers for every other initiative which is being controlled by Kerry. So that's particularly positive. But with that as an introduction, Duncan, are you going to talk to this one?
Yes, please, Chair. As the Chair has correctly highlighted, the report is supported by a very detailed appendix. That appendix is primarily provided to the committee at this meeting for information rather than specific review. As Steve Mangan highlighted in the progress update for internal audit, Steve highlighted the issues that work has progressed where possible to follow up on those actions. It's not stopped entirely, but we have had to be very mindful of the COVID-19 pressures, not just for the internal audit recommendations, but all the outstanding actions. And that appendix, sets out granular detail of agreed action plans, not just for internal audit, but external audit and other similarly agreed actions from any of the inspection processes that operate across the council. The document you've got is maintained on NLT's behalf by, again, Kerry. It's a central point of recording that information, which I think gives a much improved assurance to NLT and indeed the committee that NLT has that central grip of all of these different agreed action plans and can monitor those on a regular basis. So the purpose of this item is not to prompt the committee's review of specific progress against specific actions. because there's a lot of activity that's had to be paused to ensure a proper focus on COVID-19 pressures. What the report does is it provides you assurance that the outstanding actions that were documented prior to COVID-19, they've not been lost. They are still very visible to NLT through Kerry's maintained central record. And as the council now starts returning to more of a business as usual position, notwithstanding any fears of a second wave of COVID-19, we are starting or recommencing work on that cycle of follow-up and check and audit to look at progress monitoring on behalf of the committee and also on behalf of NLT. And we would be bringing that action tracker back to the committee to future meetings for more of a progress review and assurance to the committee, and indeed highlighting if any progress is not being achieved as agreed. So the appendix also gives you assurance that that detail has remained very visible to NLT during this period. And I think one of the last points I'd highlight is just a reality that as much as progress has been made against some of those actions, realistically, we have got to go back through those actions and understand whether their implementation, the timelines around their implementation will need to be revisited. I don't think officers, dare I use the phrase, are misusing COVID as an issue not to implement, but I think it is very much a real issue that they may not have had an opportunity to implement these actions because of being distracted into more important priorities around COVID. Indeed, some of them may actually prove redundant in the light of COVID issues. So our follow-up process has to recognise that we're not just simplistically asking for, have you completed what you agreed to complete? We have a more detailed conversation with action owners about potential implications to revised dates, or indeed that the recommendation is no longer valid. So there's a more qualitative conversation needed. And as Steve Mangan highlighted earlier, some of those conversations are happening now. We are progressing that. If any councillor has questions on detailed actions, I'd rather consider those offline than draw the committee into specific conversations. Happy to do that. Happy to take any questions now.
So any questions for Duncan or Kerry on the action trackers? Good. Okay. Now I would, with Duncan's caveat that you can't really look at the detail of individual items because things have probably moved on since the date of the report. But it is well worth just spending a couple of minutes of your time on the website, just looking at the action trackers, because it does give you a lot of confidence that these things are being dealt with and managed on a granular basis. So again, we need to note that report. Everybody happy to note the report? Perfect. So the report's noted. We have no urgent business. On the agenda, it gives some future dates. So I think we can confirm that the July date for an audit committee meeting is cancelled. That was originally in the schedule because we thought at one point a long time ago we might be approving accounts then. So we'll meet again in September and we can confirm what future meetings are necessary. Certainly there'll be one in November. I think we might have another one in December to actually approve the accounts, but we can decide that in September. So that brings us to the end of the meeting. I'd like to thank everybody for their contributions and attendance. It's 12:40. I've got you to the end nearly an hour early. It didn't seem as if we were going to get there at the beginning, but anyway, we did. So I can declare the meeting closed, and Barbara, if you can confirm that you've dropped the stream.